Good afternoon, students. So in this video, we're going to talk more about tone. And so when we write our research papers, we want to use a formal tone of English. And so when we write to our friends and family, we can use a more informal tone of English. And in that, we can use first-person case, I, my, we, our, when we write about our personal experiences. And then when we write a formal research paper, our audience is our teacher, and in that case we use a more formal tone of English, and we avoid first and second person case, you and your, and I, my, we, and us, and we focus more on third person case, he, she, they, so that your paper sounds more credible. In this video, we're going to also focus on appropriate language to use in a paper, to avoid slang and cliches, and to avoid doublespeak and jargon in a paper for a more professional tone. So you can also use Grammarly. Grammarly can also help you maintain a positive and professional tone in your writing. And so without further ado, I will be covering from the Diana Hacker, Nancy Sommers 8th edition book, and which is you guys are be using the 10th edition book. So without further ado, I'm going to be reading from the Diana Hacker, Nancy Sommers Rules for Writers book. So that's the book it's the 8th edition, Rules for Writers. So choose appropriate language. Language is appropriate when it suits your subject, engages your audience, and blends naturally with your own voice. To some extent, your choice of language will be governed by the conventions of genre in which you are writing. When in doubt about the conventions of a particular genre, lab reports, informal essays, business memos, and so on, consult your instructor. Stay away from jargon. Jargon is specialized language used among members of a trade, profession, or group. Use jargon only when readers will be familiar with, and only when plain English will not do as well. Jargon. We outsourced the work to an outfit in Ohio because we didn't have the bandwidth to tackle it in-house. Revised. We hired a company in Ohio because we had too few employees to do the work. Broadly defined, jargon includes puffed-up language designed more to impress readers than to inform them. The following are common examples from business, government, higher education, and the military, with plain English alternatives in parentheses. So instead of saying ameliorate, you can say improve. Instead of saying commence, you can say begin. Instead of saying components, you can say parts. Instead of saying endeavor, you can say try. Instead of saying exit, leave, facilitate, help, impact, affect, indicator, sign, optimal, best, most favorable, parameters, boundaries, and limits, peruse, read book, look over, prior to, before, utilize becomes use, viable becomes workable. So use more common language that the average Joe can understand to avoid misunderstandings in your writing, because sentences filled with jargon are hard to read and they are often wordy as well. The CEO should dialogue with investors about partnering with clients to purchase land in economically deprived zones. Now that's too much jargon, and you should simplify that with the CEO talked with investors about working with clients to buy land in poor neighborhoods. Now that sounds much better. Avoid pretentious language, most euphemisms, and doublespeak. Hoping to sound profound or poetic, some writers embroider their thoughts with large words and flowery phrases. Such pretentious language is so ornate and wordy that it obscures the reader's meaning. So tailors employment of multi-hued means of expression draws back the curtains and lets slip the nostalgic vantage point from which she observes American society as well as her lack of comprehension of economic realities. Did you understand what that said? Now read the revised version where you use simpler English. Taylor's use of colorful language reveals that she has a nostalgic point of view about American society and does not understand the harsh economic realities of today. So euphemisms, those are nice sounding words or phrases substituted for words thought to sound harsh or ugly, are sometimes appropriate. Many cultures, for instance, accept euphemisms when speaking or writing about excretion. So instead of saying, I have to go to the bathroom, or sexual intercourse, they did not sleep together, and the like. Most euphemisms, however, are needlessly evasive or even deceitful. Like pretentious language, they obscure the intended meaning. And so here the euphemism for pornography is adult entertainment, used car, pre-owned automobile, economically deprived, poor, negative savings, debts, strategic withdrawal, retreat or defeat. So the term doublespeak applies to any deliberately evasive or deceptive language, including euphemisms. So doublespeak is especially common in politics and business. A military retreat is described as a tactical redeployment. Enhanced interrogation is a euphemism for torture, and downsizing really means firing employees. And so here you can have edit all of this and try to find other ways of saying this. So in my youth, my family was under the constraints of difficult financial circumstances. Instead, you could say when I was young, my family was poor. So you don't want to use euphemisms and try to, instead of saying in my youth, my family was under the constraints of difficult financial circumstances. Then you sound too ornate. Instead, you would just say, when I was young, my family was poor, or my family did not have much money. In most contexts, avoid using slang, regional expressions, and non-standard English. So an example of non-standard English or regional slang would be, I ain't doing the work, or I isn't America. And in some parts of the country, or if you're at home with your friends and family, you can speak slang like that. But when you are out and about in the workplace, you need to speak in grammatically correct English, mainstream English, and what's in your grammar book. So slang is an informal and sometimes private vocabulary that expresses the solidarity of a group, such as teenagers, rock musicians, or sports fans. It is subject to more rapid change than standard English. For example, the slang teenagers use to express approval changes every few years. In the 70s, you would say cool, groovy, neat, awesome, sick, and crunk have replaced one another within the last several decades. Sometimes slang becomes so widespread that it is accepted as standard language, a standard vocabulary. Jazz, for example, started out as slang, but is now a standard term for a style of music. Although slang has a certain vitality, it is a code that not everyone understands, and it is very informal. Therefore, it is most inappropriate in most written work to use slang. When the server crashed unexpectedly, we lost 3 hours of unsaved data. Instead of saying 3 hours of saved data, went down the tubes. Went down the tubes, that's slang. So instead, you want to replace the slang with standard English. So instead of saying everything went down the tubes, you would say everything was lost. So you would say everything was lost instead of everything went down the tubes. Because let's say you're an ESL student, or somebody from France or China or Japan wants to read your business letter. If you said that the other deal went down the tubes, your Japanese businessman will go, What went down? They'll take it literally. They'll think that something actually fell down the faucet tubes, or some, and they'll actually go, what dropped? Something dropped. Something went down. Something, and it will make no sense. Kind of like to say, in my office, we like to hit the hay early. So I let the employees out early. Okay, for example, let's say you say that to a international business person, hit the hay, and then they'll literally think, okay, that you're going to go to the barn and hit that hay, and then they're going to try to think, what does that got to do with car manufacturing? They're going to be so confused. So that's why you would say, in my company, I let my employees out early so they can go to bed early. Go to bed takes the place of hitting the hay. So try to avoid slang. And also another one is, if I simply said, in my youth, I thought that records were really groovy. Okay? Number one, not many people know what a record is. And number two, even more so, what's exactly a groovy? Are you talking about the grooves on the record player? Huh? And then you're going to get, they're not going to understand it. You meant that the music sounded really, really beautiful. That you would replace records or whatever it was groovy. You would say it sounded beautiful, or it was a really good movie, as opposed to the movie was groovy. Now, in my generation, I know what groovy is. I know if I say I dig it, okay, I really dug the movie. And then somebody who's over 50 would go, you did what to the movie? So you even have an age difference, generational difference within the same United States. So it's not just simply foreigners won't understand what you're saying, but people of different ages won't understand what you're saying. So if you're Gen Z, you're the youngest person in the office, and you're using the same slang that you use for your friends, the older workers are not going to understand what you mean by goat. Oh, this is so goat. Or John is so goat. I'm not even sure I'm using that right, but it means greatest of all time. It took me, because in my time, old goat means someone who's very old, like a goat, okay? And so even the word goat has different meaning for different people of different generations. So therefore, avoid slang and just use common English if you want your audience to understand what you are saying. So regional expressions and you don't want to say, oh my God, this food grossed me out. No one's going to understand what gross you out means. So you would say, this food is disgusting. Okay? So you want to make sure you get rid of regional expressions and slang, because all of that is way too informal for even a business letter, is way too informal for a oral presentation at an office, and it's way too informal for your research paper. So regional expressions are common to a group in a geographic area. Let's talk with the bark off means let's speak frankly, is an expression in the southern United States. For example, regional expressions have the same limitations as slang and are therefore inappropriate in most writing. John was 4 blocks from the house before he remembered to cut the headlights off. So it's better to say turn off the headlights. Seamus wasn't for sure, but he thought the whales might be migrating during his trip to Oregon. So standard English is the English used in all academic, business, and professional fields. Nonstandard English is spoken by people with a common regional or social heritage. Although nonstandard English may be appropriate when spoken within a close group, like with your friends and family, it is out of place in most formal writing, such as if you're writing for your teacher, or writing for your boss, or writing for schoolmates. So keep the informal writing at home with your friends and family. So that's why you only use, you try not to use first person and second person case in your academic research papers, and stick with third person case. The governor said he don't know if he will approve the budget without the clean air provision. And so in some parts of the country, it's okay to say he don't know, but if you're writing to your boss and you're at work, you need to stick to standard English. So the governor said he doesn't know if he will approve the budget without the clean air provision. So if you speak a non-standard dialect, try to identify the ways in which your dialect differs from standard English. This also goes for pronunciation as well. So you got to try to stay away from your regional pronunciation. For instance, my regional dialect, where I come from, is New York. So normally I would say, I want a cup of coffee. I'm going to go down Wilshire Boulevard. Okay, that's where I come from. Okay, we'd speak like that. But then if I say that to when I first came to California, I came from New York, and I spoke like that without realizing that I sounded so regional. And I remember the waitress looked at me and said, "What did she say?" I said, I want a glass of water. I said, water, like that. And I remember the waiter had no clue what I was saying. And I didn't understand why after all, I was speaking English, in New York, it is America after all. And then somebody next to me who was from New York then said, she wants a glass of water and she wants to know where is Wilshire Boulevard. Where is Wilshire Boulevard? Oh, then suddenly he understood. And of course, that's how I met my first friend here in California when I first came to California. So, and of course, in my regional dialect, I was a California, instead of saying California. So you also got to make sure that your pronunciation doesn't go regional. So it's got to be mainstream. And anybody who works in radio, or if you're going to be a television announcer on TV, also you got to try to cut out as much as you can. You can have a little bit of your regional accent just to sound charming, but for the most part, you got to go mainstream. Otherwise, nobody's going to understand you. If you speak a non-standard dialect, try to identify the ways in which your dialect differs from standard English. Look especially for the following features of non-standard English, which commonly causes problem, not just in speaking, but in writing. Misusing verb forms such as began and begun, leaving S endings off verbs, leaving ED endings off verbs, leaving out necessary verbs. I done my work, instead of saying I have done my work, for instance. Using double negatives. I done nothing wrong. That's a double negative, instead of saying I haven't done anything wrong. So you don't use two negatives in a row. Yet some people talk like that. So that's why it's important to learn proper grammar, so that way you can learn to recognize what is standard English and what is non-standard English. For instance, in some parts of the country you would say, that there shoes stink. You don't say that there, you would say those shoes stink. So those are all examples of non-standard English that you are not going to put into your academic paper, because if you do, you're going to get points off for grammar. So choose an appropriate level of formality. In deciding on a level of formality, consider both your subject and your audience. Does the subject demand a dignified treatment or a relaxed tone? Will readers be put off if you assume too close a relationship with them, or might you alienate them by seeming too distant? For most college and professional writing, some degree of formality is appropriate. In a job application, for example, it is a mistake to sound breezy and informal, too informal in a job application. I'd like to get that sales job you've got in the paper. No one's going to hire you if you talk too informal. So more formal English sounds more mature. I would like to apply for the position of sales associate advertised in the Peoria Journal-Star. So informal writing is appropriate for private letters, personal email and text messages, and business correspondence between close associates. Like spoken conversation, informal writing allows contractions. Don't, I'll, and colloquial words like kids and kinda. Vocabulary and sentence structures are rarely complex, but in choosing a level of formality, above all, be consistent. In other words, you have to have a consistent, that was the topic of my previous video, in which you've got to have consistent perspective, consistent verb tense, in order to not confuse your reader. When a writer's voice shifts from one level of formality to another, the reader receives mixed messages. So if you want to sound formal, you're going to write out your contractions. So instead of saying, I don't know, you're going to say, I do not know, which sounds a lot more formal than I don't know. And you try to avoid saying I, you would say, the author does not know the answer. The author referring to I. Instead of saying, I don't know, you would say, the author does not know when you're writing. Once a pitcher for the Blue Jays, Jorge shared with me the secrets of his trade. His lesson commenced with his famous curveball implemented by tucking the little finger behind the ball. Next, he elucidated the mysteries of the sucker's pitch, a slow ball coming behind a fast windup. Words such as commenced and elucidated are inappropriate for the subject matter, and they clash with informal terms such as sucker pitch and fast windup. And so therefore you want to keep your tone. If you're going to use an informal tone, then keep all your words in an informal tone. If you're going to be in a formal tone, then all your words have to be in a formal tone. Avoid sexist language. Sexist language is language that stereotypes, that demeans women or men. Using non-sexist language is a matter of courtesy, of respect for and sensitivity for the feelings of others. Some sexist language is easy to recognize because it reflects genuine disdain for women, referring to a woman as a chick, for instance, or calling a lawyer a lady lawyer. Other forms of sexist language are less blatant. The following practices, while they may not result from conscious sexism, reflect stereotypical thinking, referring to members of one profession as exclusively male or exclusively female, teachers as women, or computer engineers as men, for instance, using different conventions when naming or identifying women and men, or assuming an exclusively male or female audience. Stereotypical language. After a nursing student graduates, she must face a difficult state board exam. Well, not all nurses are female. Some nurses are male. So therefore, you would say, after a nursing student graduates, they must face a difficult state board exam. So you take out the she and the he, and you write they, and then that would incorporate both male and female. Running for city council are Boris Statsky, an attorney, and Mrs. Cynthia Jones, a professor of English and mother of three. And the mother of three is irrelevant. How come if you're going to say that, you might as well say Boris Statsky, an attorney, father of two, and Cynthia Jones, a mother of three. Okay, if you're going to mention mother of three, then you got to mention he's a father of two. Then at least that's consistent. Still, other forms of sexist language result from outdated traditions. The pronouns he, him, and his, for instance, were traditionally used to refer generically to persons of either sex. Nowadays, to avoid that sexist usage, some writers use she, her, and hers generically, or you substitute the female pronouns alternatively with the male pronouns. So a generic pronoun. A journalist is motivated by his deadline. A good interior designer treats her client ideas respectfully. I think that you can make it even more generic. You would say you just put it into the plural. Journalists are motivated by their deadline. Interior designers treat their clients respectfully. Okay, in my opinion, just make everything plural, and that way you get rid of the he and the her and the sexist stuff. Okay, so chairman. So instead of saying chairman, you would say chairperson. Instead of saying congressman, you would say member of Congress. Instead of saying fireman, you say firefighter. Instead of saying foreman, you say supervisor. And instead of saying mailman, you say mail carrier, postal worker, letter carrier. And instead of saying we're going to boldly go where no man has gone before. Dun, 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 dun. Yeah, it's Star Trek. Now, that was in the 60s. The original Star Trek series had that as their ringer, their saying. Then by the 1980s, they considered that where no man has ever gone before. When even on board the original Star Trek, there was Nicole Nichols. Well, she's not a man, so therefore where no one has ever gone before. So by the time they had the second in the 80s, when they had the next generation, they changed the man into where no one has ever gone before. So that way you get rid of the sexist overtone that only men go travel into space. So instead of saying manpower, you would say personnel or staff. And instead of saying police, you get the idea. So every time you say a man, you have a different way of saying it so that it doesn't refer to a certain gender. And so you would say, this one, here they have more examples. But I would just put everything into plural. I would just say journalists, designers, and there. Whatever it is. See, this is they actually have it too. Journalists are motivated by their deadlines. Good interior designers treat their clients' ideas respectfully, or even better, just recasting the sentence. A journalist is motivated by a deadline. Well, that's even better than putting everything in the plural. A good interior designer treats clients' ideas respectfully. Okay, that's better than plural. I'll give him that. Okay, so revise language that may offend groups of people. So instead of saying Indian, you would say Lakota. You're not going to say Oriental. You're going to say Asian, and then you're going to say it was no surprise that Greer, a Chinese American, was selected for the honors chemistry. So instead of saying a Chinese American, you would say an excellent math and science student. So that way it's, that's very, very impartial. And that's about it, I think. Yeah. So, and that's about it. And so this ends my video on tone and on staying away from slang and that sort of thing. So if you have any questions about slang and how to use formal or informal language, you can always feel free to email me anytime.